Hello, welcome to Gimme Empathy. I'm Scott Mercer, and this is a podcast, and you're listening to it. On this episode, I have a politician on the podcast. Andrew Bartlett is my guest today. Andrew's got quite a history in Australian politics. So he served as Senator for Queensland with the Australian Democrats from 1997 to 2008, and he led the Democrats from 2002 to 2004 and was then deputy leader until the effective end of the party in 2008 after a series of retirements and electoral defeats left them without any more representatives in the Senate. Since then, Andrew has been a member of the Greens Party, most recently serving again as Senator for Queensland when the sitting Green, Larissa Waters, was caught up in the crisis surrounding Section 44 of the Australian Constitution regarding dual citizenship and eligibility for elected office, all that bullshit. So he filled in there for a while, but he left the Senate again last year after Waters cleared up her citizenship status, and now he is running for the House of Representatives in the upcoming federal election, standing for the seat of Brisbane. I know Andrew through community radio 4ZZZ. Andrew has been there on and off since the 1980s, since he was still based out at St. Lucia. Listeners may know him more recently from breakfast shows such as Breakfast Will Tear Us Apart and A Burst of Brisbane. Andrew's a big supporter of local music. You can tell that through his playlists. He very much still has his finger on the pulse of what's going on out there. And I often see him out at gigs still, which is pretty remarkable. I pay attention to who is able to and who makes the effort to go out to gigs, and Andrew is one of them. He did at one point have some musical adventures of his own that he'll tell you about, playing drums. But we start this episode talking about Shadow Play Cafe, which is a little cafe in Fortitude Valley that he's getting off the ground with his partner. So do strap in, it's a longer one. And this is episode 55 with Andrew Bartlett. So, have you got a food prep area there yet?
That's what we're getting finalised. So it'll be mostly made on site, but we just got to get that part of it completely done, and then that's got to be sort of licensed or whatever by council for food areas. And you can't get the alcohol licence till you got the food. Given it's not it's not just a bar; it's a licensed cafe type of thing. And some foods is Danielle's done all that stuff, so I haven't really looked at it closely, but, some of the things like biscuits and most cakes and stuff you don't, but other things you do. But to do anything substantial beyond just a few muffins and things, you need to have a licence. So,
Is a cafe like your first foray into small business?
Oh, yeah. Yes, haven't done anything like that before, so...
Has it been a bit of a learning curve?
Oh, yeah, well, I knew it would be, I guess, but it was something completely different, so I couldn't really pick the timing of it. It was sort of an opportunity that came up, ironically linked to the closing of the Globe because of, all of the kegs and the fridges, the bar fridges and stuff. And Paul there, I don't know if you know Paul, I can't remember, but Paul that ran the Globe was basically trying to sell up all his stuff pretty quickly, so he'd got it at pretty cheap price, but had to do it then, and then once we got it then we had to lease the place to put it in, and it's taken longer than anticipated to get the whole place running, which has been unfortunate, but anyway, that's just the way it is. So I was still doing the Senate stuff, and it seemed interesting enough to be worth taking the plunge for, or jumping off the cliff for, or whatever. But it took longer than anticipated to get moving, and I ended up quitting the Senate job earlier than I'd planned to. So it hasn't been ideal, but I guess I felt I was going to do the politics thing anyway, and I'd already decided by then I was going to have the shot at the House of Reps, and if that works, I'd be elected as that and doing that, and that'd be a whole new thing, and she could do the cafe stuff, and if it didn't work, then this would be something completely different that I could also immerse myself in that would, help completely break from political stuff and sink myself into something sufficiently different.
So, Andrew, you grew up in a Catholic family.
I did.
5 kids.
Who's been telling you these things?
Were your parents, what were their political leanings?
I guess they were, what we'd call conservative, old-style conservative. My recollections pretty strongly growing up was they talked a lot about politics, but more in the sense of issues, policy issues, or just issues, social issues, and what politicians were saying rather than through any party framework. So, it was only retrospectively I figured out they're probably predominantly conservative, just, they hated Gough Whitlam, but they hated Malcolm Fraser and generally seemed to be, pretty down on everybody and stuff. But my mother, she wasn't a member of, but was sort of linked into and supportive of the DLP, which was Democratic Labor Party, which was an offshoot of Labor when the split over in the 50s, the big Labor split. So they were a manifestation of that, I guess. But I don't think they had pre-existing Labor leanings or whatever. They're just culturally linked into that DLP thing, which was very much a Catholic thing of the time.
Growing up in Brisbane, how did your parents feel about Joh Bjelke-Petersen?
I don't really remember them talking about him a lot. I think maybe just they were more focused on national and international stuff, and also, even though they talked about political issues from time to time, they didn't really talk about party politics per se in the way that I'd think of it. So, I do remember the occasional comment, grumbling about the Ratbag Street March protesters and those sorts of things. I don't especially recall them, saying massively praiseworthy things about Bjelke-Petersen, but I'm very, very different to my parents, particularly my father, but they really did value the exploration of issues and the, intellectual inquiry side of it rather than, just cheer squatting for your team type of approach to politics. So,
what did your parents do?
My dad was an engineer. He was a civil engineer for a mob called Hornibrooks, who used to have a work yard, I guess you'd call it, over at Bulimba. It's all housing now, but it was on the riverfront at Bulimba. And my mother, the parlance of the day was called a housewife, was that term. I don't hear that much these days, thankfully. But, she was an interesting person. She only died just last year, and, so I guess you revisit thinking about what she did. But, as was the thing of the day in the 50s, she left school before she was 15, but she was working in a bank. But, once you got married, you quit your job. That's what you did or had to do. And so was with my father. He was actually in Papua New Guinea when it was Australian colony or territory in the 50s and early 60s, doing all the things civil engineers do, bridges and roads and wharves and mines and things. And then they moved down to Queensland just not long before I was born. So, I was the youngest of those 5 that you mentioned, so she was, caring for us all the way through. But she eventually went back to university, almost finished a degree and basically did everything but the last subject and didn't finish it because she wasn't doing it to get a degree. She was doing it to show that she could do it and to get the knowledge. So she sort of made a point of not finishing it for some reason. But she also ended up developing a career working in Catholic social justice sphere. It was strange because, speaking of them being sort of probably conservative leaning, but, conservative was quite different to what it is these days. Conservative now, when we think of the Liberals and Nationals, to me means, reactionary bigot, and they certainly weren't that at all. Yeah, so she worked in the Catholic social justice area, more about employment and working with people about, how to apply for jobs and do resumes, these things called job clubs, which were probably a precursor to some of the privatised job search agencies that happen these days, but didn't have the same funding structure under it. It was basically just a straightforward service that people could provide to unemployed folks to get job searching skills, but without all the dodgy financial carrots dangled in front of them the way modern employment agencies have. So, yeah, she did a lot in that area, and not-for-profit groups, I guess, around advocating for recognition of women's work, unpaid women's work and caring work and home work. So, going back a long way now, but there was the stridently anti-feminist groups. There was a mob called Women Who Want to Be Women, who were specifically stridently advocating that women should be staying in the home, in the kitchen, and wearing pink and cooking cakes, and then obviously a strong move socially for women to have equal rights in the workplace. And I guess my mother's focus was supporting that, but wanting to make sure that unpaid work wasn't devalued along the way, which I think is still a valid issue for carers and volunteer work of all sorts.
Was there a point growing up where you felt your own values were deviating from your parents' conservative values?
Possibly. Like I said, it sounds a bit strange in hindsight, but at the time I wasn't thinking of them as a label of conservative or anything. So as I became less so, I wasn't thinking of myself as doing so in a way that was, rejecting their approach. I mean, I was probably more just socially different because I was, very much into alternative music and, long hair and nail polish and earrings and all that sort of stuff. So they were more conservative in that other sense of the word, I suppose, of just not in a really prudish way. That's just the way they were, So he was pretty straight-laced, my father, and we didn't really get on. We didn't fight. We just didn't talk. So my family in general were very much of the. It's good, pretty, particularly as I've got older and seen so many other people's lives and seen closer, as a social worker and other things of what dysfunctional families are really like, pretty fortunate really. But having said that, we weren't not really into, outward displays of emotion or loudness or anything like that. So I can only remember one example of one raised voice ever. So didn't mean people didn't get grumpy. They just got silently grumpy and smouldered a lot. So there's probably a lot of silent smouldering around the place, but...
Did you feel like you were walking on eggshells a lot?
Sometimes. I guess you can get skilled at avoidance, I suppose. You avoid topics so you might disagree or whatever. It was okay. I mean, I don't, like painting it as overly negative and get all the amateur psychoanalysts out there reading things into it. It was just, like everyone's childhood, it just was what it was. And even more so than me, my father was very much not one for personal conversation or expression of emotions or anything like that. So the manifestation of us not getting on was just that we didn't talk about anything.
Well, how did you find that alternative culture in Brisbane in the 70s and 80s?
I don't have any explicit recollection of, determinedly seeking out on a voyage of discovery of, new intellectual lands or exploring alternative cultures or whatever. You just, gradually go along and do stuff and get attracted, drawn towards stuff you find interesting. But it was 1982 I first started at Queensland Uni, and
was it a hotbed of anything in particular at the time?
Wouldn't be the description I would have used. From everything I've heard since, including right through till now, I'm quite interested in local history and political history and social action and all of that. And I guess when you're in the middle of stuff, it's hard to be objective about it. But looking back at a lot of things and the things that happened prior to that in the 70s and 60s out of UQ, it was much more strident then. It was already tapering off in the 80s and much more so after student fees were brought back in. So I wouldn't have thought a hotbed myself, but, it was the era of, in terms of the university itself, there was certainly, quite significant pockets of political resistance and strong opposition to Bjelke-Petersen regime, and Triple Z, which was based at Queensland Uni at the time, was undoubtedly a big part of that. I just wouldn't have attached the university more broadly to it. There was the odd big protest when Joe Bjelke-Petersen got an honorary degree or an honorary doctorate or whatever. There was, pretty sizable protest out there, as there should have been. But, you could certainly very easily coast through there without getting radicalised, or even having the temptation of being radicalised, probably, unless you went looking for it.
Do you remember when you did first discover 4ZZZ?
Yeah, I do. I remember, I was aware of it from when I was at school and, would have listened to it from time to time, and friends talked about it. I was always really into music. And, one of the things I guess made me more interested in Triple Z was just you discover new music the first music I liked, Suzi Quatro and The Sweet and some of those sort of bands, and Daddy Cool, Skyhooks and stuff. I remember camping out at the Park Royal Motel or Hotel was called then. I can't remember what it's called. Same place is still there, just opposite the Botanic Gardens in Alice Street, corner of Alice and Albert. When Fleetwood Mac played at Festival Hall, and camped out there for days getting their autographs and stuff. And whatever year that was, 1980 or something, I think, 79. Somebody can look it up. But yeah, I guess, Triple Z had other music, different music, new music. You couldn't, there wasn't a lot else. There was, top 40 commercial radio, 4AP, as it was called then. There wasn't a lot of competition in terms of finding anything new. So I was aware of it in that sense, but I suppose it had never occurred to me that it'd be something I could be part of. But I remember, walking with a friend of mine who I'd went to school with first year at uni. It was probably around March or something, so I wouldn't have been there long, and we're walking through the car park behind the Chanel Theatre, just straight past where Triple Z was, and this friend of mine saying, "Oh, there's Triple Z, let's just, go inside and see if we can do a radio show." And, being fairly shy type, I just thought, that's ridiculous. How could that be doable? But, he was not such a shy type, so he just dragged me in, and, didn't take long before we were doing graveyard shifts together at sort of 2 o'clock in the morning, and just got pulled more and more in, which I guess is one of those things. Everybody's different, I know, but I always, people often ask me, how do I get involved in this, or how do I, what's the best way to change the world, or what's the best way to get involved in politics? And I feel the best way is to try out a few different things and see what grabs you and what pulls you in, rather than determine it in advance. And just we spent most of the next 6 or 7 years of my life hanging around Triple Z more than anywhere else. Went back to part-time while I was at uni, and took quite a while to finish any degree, really, because I didn't really have much of an idea of what I wanted to study or do, so I was bouncing around between subjects trying to find something that grabbed me. So the thing that grabbed me was Triple Z instead.
What do you think's changed about the culture of Triple Z? Like when you would walk in for a shift back in the 80s, what's immediately different?
There's some huge differences, really. I'm speaking as much from my experience being on the board of Triple Z now for 6 years or 7 years, or whatever it is. I think it's 6. And I actually was on the board in the 80s for a little while, but the board then was, the people that signed the annual report at the end of the year, and beyond that had no role at all. It was all run by what was called the Station Collective, which was basically just all the volunteers and paid staff. So, that's a big change. You'd have those weekly or fortnightly collective meetings of an evening, and could go for hours, and people would decide that collectively.
Was that an efficient way of doing things?
No. So just give a short answer for that one. Look, like everything, it's got its pluses and minuses, but no, it certainly wasn't efficient. It had more of a sense of people having buy-in, but there's pros and cons with every process, and that's a whole thesis in itself. In fact, I think now Dr. or Professor Heather Anderson, who was around Triple Z and with the Prisoner Show for many years, she's written a book or a thesis or something on Triple Z more broadly, but part of it is that the change in the way the station was run. The big things was it was run by a collective, but at the same time it had, I think, 13 full-time paid staff, including 4 full-time announcers. So the daytime, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m, Monday to Friday was, 4 announcers on every day. So that's obviously massively different to now. You had the same person doing the breakfast shift every day of the week, the same person doing the drive. All of that had 3 full-time paid journalists, so the newsroom was very different. And the on-air sound was much more male as well. Most of the full-time announcers, certainly for the first part of the 80s, were male, as more females came in through the latter part. So just the number of paid staff, the on-air sound had the same people Monday to Friday, and the collective running the joint, or I guess running. There was a station coordinator. I was paid as a station finance person for a while. There was full-time promotions people doing a lot of gigs, which is another thing that's very different now. Is you see this in some of the archives and that, but Triple Z had its own venue different times through the 80s, and you'd have gigs on 2-3 times a week. And a Triple Z run gigs and promoted gigs, and that was a key revenue stream, and it was also a key part of, obviously flowed into the sound of the station as well. So all of that's quite different.
I guess on that front, it feels like there are more music venues out there now that bands can play at, and they don't need Triple Z to organise as many shows. Yeah,
look, there's more venues. There's just an absolute avalanche of more recordings of local bands. I mean, I don't know if there's more bands around. Probably are more bands around, but maybe it was just harder to see them before because it was harder to record stuff. It was much more expensive to record, and then to distribute it again was more difficult. So the amount of local music actually recorded and playable on Triple Z was way smaller, whereas now, people record in their lounge room or on, every other sides of the world, or just on a laptop anywhere, and, mix it all on a Mac and, email it around or upload it to Bandcamp or whatever. And, so there's literally, as you'd know, there's hundreds of new songs by local bands every month compared to these days. 80s, to have a new vinyl album of a local band be a handful a month, I would reckon, that's my memory anyway. It'd be demo tapes and things like that, but in terms of actual albums.
What was it like going to gigs in the 80s? Like with the risk of the QPS cracking down on you and all that?
Yeah, there's certainly some of that. I mean, it's easy for me to say because, people don't recognise at the time, but again, being more aware of these things now, the white privilege of and most university students in those days and other people, you'd get low-level police harassment just for being young, and if you had long hair or whatever like I did, then you're perhaps a bit more likely to it. And if you were someone that was potentially carrying some dope around or something, you're having a higher risk. But the real people that copped it were the Aboriginal people in particular, just ferociously bashed, and that was something I really was not fully aware of. I mean, we did have the land rights protests flowing out of the Commonwealth Games in 1982, and a growing awareness, including at Triple Z, of the importance of listening more to voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But still, unless you're working in the area, and I was studying social work by the middle 80s, so I should have been more aware of this, but we did a little bit on it, but we really only touched it. Some people, Lindy Morrison, who you would be aware of and listeners would know as a drummer from the Go-Betweens, but she did social work at University of Queensland, I think probably 10 years before I did. I ended up getting to know her reasonably well many years later when I was in the Senate, and she did focus on working with Aboriginal people around Brisbane and around Queensland, travelling around Queensland, and the violence and the racism is just horrifying, but has not gone away either. So yeah, there was certainly a bit of that fear of the cops going to raid this gig tonight and that sort of thing. But if you're a bit of a shy, retiring type like me, that would sort of melt in the background rather than a skinhead who wanted to take them on, or someone who was a specific target. And some of the more high-profile political activists, it's more of a general member of a bunch of groups and go along to meetings and go along to events, but it wasn't the person out front or a known name or anything. But some of those people who were known names definitely got full-on police targeting, whether it was being bashed or whether it was the risk of being arrested and stitched up and verbaled.
You were a goth though, like you must have stood out a little bit to the cops.
Yeah, well, I suppose, I don't know. I mean, there's the long hair, probably more than anything, sort of long black hair and stuff. I wasn't a full-blown, oceans of lace and face makeup goth, although I did do the nail polish and earrings stuff. I don't know. I don't know if it was just terminology of the time or differences in subgenres, but I'd more usually labelled as a swampy back then.
Swampy? What's that term?
Swampy is a bit more like scientists and that sort of music, some more grungy guitar with Robert Smith style hair, I suppose.
Oh,
that sort of blend. I suppose, although Birthday Party got called goth. But yeah, more grungy guitar, a bit less sort of gloomy, grungy. I don't know. Joy Division. I mean, like Joy Division, I would never have called a goth band. Maybe that's just because the label didn't exist then. They were just post-punk or new wave or whatever. Or it's what I've always hated labels, genre labels, because they're obscure more than they reveal half the time. Plus, they become so dated. But I did like the Sisters of Mercy. So I just didn't feel like I could aspire to that level of goth perfection. So I just thought of myself as a grungy, dirty, swampy.
What was it about that style and that music that you think appealed to you?
I don't know. It just resonates in my brain nicely. Still does. No, I don't know. I mean, it's all sort of gloomy, I suppose. And, I never liked The Cure as much, but retrospectively do quite like those early, really black Cure albums and a couple of ones they did subsequently, Blood Flowers and others that were really quite dark. And, the music works with it really well. I mean, I still love Joy Division, probably... Obviously tragic for Ian Curtis, but probably good for them that, they only put out, 50 or so songs and didn't go disco or whatever. So they've got a, uncorruptible legacy because it just sits there, which I wouldn't say the same about New Order that flowed out of them. Although, quite like a bunch of their stuff, but it's not the same. I don't know. Same reason I like sort of vampire stuff or something, really. I mean, some of it's the look and feel, some of it's whatever it resonates. And I did have one psychologist type person at me at one stage, because seeing you've done your research would have no doubt be fairly well aware of reasonably in-depth depression for many years. So they tried to sort of argue that, these Joy Division lyrics made me depressed or whatever, which I tend to think in fact, I'm certain it's more the other way around. You identify with stuff and Leonard Cohen, who I didn't get into until I was older. And it's more of a feeling, and some of it's, and most of the way through Nick Cave's career, I'd have sort of lost touch with his stuff in the last little while. It doesn't grab me in the same way, but some of it's pretty corny and some of it's pretty obvious and all that, but it's still counterintuitively, some of it's quite fun. Some of early Nick Cave and some of Cohen's stuff's quite good sense of humour, really.
Yeah, on the causation or correlation or the relationship between the culture you like and mental health. I would think that having depression and finding darker sort of art, you would feel less alienated and less alone because you can relate to someone else who has had similar feelings and has put that out there creatively.
Yeah, look, I actually think it's really important, seeing we've got onto it, and really valuable for some people. Everybody's brain's different. I've read and explored this stuff off and on over the years, some of it semi-professionally through social work and stuff, and some of it out of, self-exploration, and some of it just out of interest. But I think quite clearly it's really valuable for a lot of people, and it's part of why... as to me, that's the big thing about music in general in all its forms, not just the gloomy music, but anything, is that the way it connects into people's souls and psyches in this really quite mystical way is really quite amazing. I mean, it's why it is that it does it with so many people, not everybody, but so many people. It's really quite interesting. But it's obviously really valuable for some people. It gives them a connection and makes them feel less alone, or it makes parts of the world make more sense or whatever.
When did you start playing music yourself?
Sort of near the end of high school, I think. I mean, I've never really thought of myself as... It's a bit silly, really, because I've played in enough bands. I should really think of myself as being a musician, but I feel like I never did it properly enough to properly think of myself as that. So I've always felt like it's just a bit of a... I'm not sure what the right word is. I don't feel like I'm even good enough at it to call it a hobby, but except whenever I see plenty of other people do it and think, I can probably do that. But anyway, yeah, I learnt piano for a year or two when I was quite young, about 8 or 9, I think, and hated it. And, had the nuns teaching me, one of the, nuns that would hit you over the knuckles if you got it wrong or whatever. That style of teaching that you'd think was designed to drive your desire to learn away. So I managed to convince my mother to let me quit. Still remember her saying, it's okay, I'll let you quit, but you'll regret this one day. And I did. It's just really annoying when your parents are right about something. But I really did wish I'd kept doing that. But got taught drums properly for not terribly long, maybe about a year. A guy called Harry Lebler, who's, I presume he's dead now, but because he was older-ish then, but he was sort of known as a bit of a well-known sort of drum tutor guy. Actually taught Jeffrey Wegner from the Laughing Clowns at one stage, although that's, Jeffrey Wegner's sort of up in a total different stratosphere. I think he's his own universe when it comes to drumming. So I'm not saying that's just, a bit of random name dropping really more than anything else. It's one of those connections, but no connection in terms of ability. But yeah, I only did it for a year or so, but so mostly self-taught, and like many people, the main thing way I learnt was, by getting involved in a band and figuring out how to do it.
What kind of music were you making in these bands?
Well, the first one was a group called Iron Vertical, and I suppose people would think it was a bit of a swampy goth, Curie Sisters of Mercy style sounding thing by coincidence. But, we got a song at number 3 in the Triple Z Hot 100 in 1980 something.
Oh, wow.
So, I just hang on to that as my, life goal achievement. And, I downplay things a fair bit, I suppose, but in those days, local bands weren't as frequent in the Hot 100, mostly because, like I said before, there weren't so many recordings. But
is it true that you once cast the deciding vote in the Hot 100?
That is true. That is actually true. It was the year President's 11 got number 1 with Summer Vacation. First time Brisbane band got number 1, and I was, I don't know what my role was in the station, but anyway, it was one of the things I was doing was counting the votes of the Hot 100, which were all paper. People would mail in their votes, and they could vote for any damn thing, any song of any year, I think, still at that stage. And I decided, instead of voting myself, my votes would be just the tiebreakers. So I didn't cast a vote. I'd just use that as my votes, and they were tied at number 1 with, pretty sure it was The Cure primary, which I really, really like. It's one of my all-time favourite songs, but I nonetheless voted for President's 11 because they're a local band, and I did really like that. I still do like that song. I like their original demo recording, the one that's around these days that's played, that was on the Triple Z Behind the Banana Curtain CD, was a re-recording. Like often happened, I think, in those days, people would do a really rough demo, and then that'd get played, and then they'd scrape together a bit of money, or they'd win a comp or something, and then they'd re-record it properly.
The Riptides, I think, had a bunch of them.
Yeah. And as often as not, you'd like the original rough, raw version. Maybe it's just because that's the one you got to know and like, but sometimes I feel like rough and raw is better than, polished. And so, anyway, I don't think I announced it at the time. I think I kept it on the down low because somebody would have complained about it or something, but I told somebody at some stage somewhere along the way many years later. Might have been a guy from President's 11, actually.
Did you go into social work straight after uni?
I finished my social work degree in, I think, 87, and because I'd faffed around so long doing a whole lot of different subjects, I'd almost also completed a Bachelor of Arts. So I thought I'd finish that off as well. So I stuck around another year, and it was all part-time, and I was, hanging out at Triple Z all the time anyway. Or doing other stuff. I mean, I was playing in his bands by that stage as well, so I was spending some time doing that. And this was also the very final years of Bjelke Petersen government. I mean, when they seemed like they were at their peak of their powers, but they were also just about to crumble. So it was quite a very interesting period.
Because he was about to run for PM, wasn't he?
Yeah, 87 was the Joe for PM election, so he probably had already tried that. And 83 is when they got government in their own right, after a couple of Liberals defected to the Nationals. So the Nationals was a National Party government with not even any Liberals in there. There were National Party members for, places like Mansfield and Aspley and Toowong. I mean, I think UQ, a guy called Earl Bailey was a newsreader, National Party member for whatever seat that was, Indooroopilly or something, for a term or two. So, they're barbarians at the gates. You had freaking National Party in the middle of the heart of Brisbane. And then they won it again in 86. So, yeah, it looked like they were, consolidated even. Anyway, so, yes, I finished my arts degree as well. And I actually ended up starting a master's in something or other, social planning or something. But I've figured I should probably get a job. I mean, I did actually have a paid job at Triple Z for a while, and driving taxis and things as well, but thought I'd try that. So I did do social work out of uni, I guess, in effect, for a little while.
What exactly was your role?
It's the old Department of Social Security, which is called Centrelink these days, but back then it was Department of Social Security, and also a thing called the Commonwealth Employment Service, which was before they privatised that and contracted out to all the job search networks. It was all government-owned free service. So it was social work with Social Security. Basically, you got all the people in the too hard basket, in short, and worked with them as individuals, but also tried to connect in with all the local services in the community and connect people to supports that way that might be able to help them for some of their specific needs, or particularly if Social Security would cut them off. One part of the Social Security department would say, sorry, we're cutting you off, and then that second thing they'd say was, here, but we can help you, here's a social worker. So a bit of a band-aid sort of role a lot of the time, but it was, like all of these roles, it gives you an insight into reality.
Did it kind of shift anything in your brain about how the whole system worked?
Yeah, it probably did. I think, it's a bit ironic I ended up doing social work because I'm not really very good at being social or sociable, but I was more interested in the community development side of it and how, you work with people collectively to make change rather than the sort of individual counselling stuff. But even within that, it's obviously it's a classic example of a system and the hoops it makes people jump through and the impacts of structures on people's lives, and how much difference just a small thing, from the random thing of whether somebody was lucky enough to get the office jerk or the office nice person on the counter that morning could mean the difference between them, having a home or not by the end of the week. But, that also translated to the structural scale, and I guess that's, a better understanding that it's not just, people needing to be nicer or whatever, but that all of those people are stuck within a structure, and if the structure's operated in a way where they don't care about crushing people for the sake of, whatever reasons, then it's actually quite hard to stop if the structure's set up that way. You can do all you want as an individual, but if you can't change the structures, you'll be pushing it uphill. And you could see that in the area, what they called the compliance section. I don't know if they still do call it something else now, probably, but the people had to go and chase after people that were potentially not declaring their income or not declaring relationships or whatever, catching the dole bludgers, that sort of stuff. And you could see in those offices, all it took was you could just see a direct line from the minister of the day saying something about cracking down on dole bludgers to, those people, making more noise about how many people they'd caught this week compared to the week before. It was just, and that all those sort of informal impacts, sort of beyond just, improving the law or improving the policy. You could have exactly the same policy, but same thing if you've got the people above decide that they've got to be administered in a particular way, for good or bad. It just has such a big impact.
At what point did it occur to you to attempt to make one of these changes that would be more systemic than just being part of the Band-Aid?
Well, I guess, alongside doing that, I was involved in a bunch of organisations, that thing I said earlier about just joining some groups and trying things out and seeing if you could be of use and seeing if it dragged you in. So, alongside Triple Z, and I really shouldn't understate how much, I was flowing out of there, I was quite involved in playing in bands. I forget now because it's so long ago, and it was just part of life then, it's just what you did, so you didn't really think about it. But looking back, we were playing gigs around town or going to other friends' gigs, and so going to see so many bands all the time. And alongside that, and different groups, Citizens for Democracy or, the Anti-Street March campaign or the right to stand on a soapbox and speak in Queen Street Mall or some other land rights stuff and gay rights stuff, as it was called at the time, environmental issues. Groups like Conservation Foundation and Wilderness Society were all happening back then. I was interested in animal rights stuff, so involved with animal liberation as well. And, I guess part of that idea of the structural stuff, rather than just individual standalone issues, I had always been interested in politics, and obviously with Bjelke Petersen and all that sort of thing, and you look at political parties and how it works and whether this whole system could work better. And I joined a political party along as part of that, which was the Australian Democrats, and I don't know, for a bunch of reasons, but partly because I felt like both the established parties, I mean, obviously, Joe was the Antichrist, small a Antichrist, though, I don't want to be too harsh. So, getting rid of them and getting Labor in was a overarching goal, but within that I still didn't feel like they were particularly inspirational, and I felt like a two-party system didn't do sufficient. I mean, we had Labor government through that era with Bob Hawke. He got elected in 83, I think it was. So I just felt like having an extra force in there, extra diversity might be beneficial.
And at the time, were the Greens more of a one policy thing? I guess having risen off the back of the Franklin Dam protests in the 80s?
Yeah, I mean, the Greens didn't really exist, to be honest. The Democrats were already there. They were already in the Senate from the 1977. They were there. Greens, there were some of them in Parliament in Tasmania, but they were called the Green Independents. There was no Green Party here. But, it was the same thing. I joined them, Democrats, the same as I joined other groups, and same as I got involved in Triple Z, and you just do stuff and see if it works, and I got pulled into that around the same time as other things, and 30 years ago, I guess, 1989. I was doing some stuff with them. I'd, help out at a by-election or something, an election campaign, the 1990 federal election. Got more involved, and then someone got elected that time, Cheryl Curnow, who wasn't that well known then, but became very well known nationally, and that was when she first got elected. And because I've been involved in the campaigns and she'd see me around in meetings and things, asked me if I'd be interested in just working temporarily on her staff when she started, until some other guy, some, super guru, big shot, whiz-bang guy started. That's sort of the way it was. I thought about it in my mind anyway, if I could just do some work for her for a couple of months sort of thing. And so I did that as well, part-time, and the big shot whiz-bang guy ended up put off till October and then put off till November, and he ended up never coming, so I just stayed in that role. And
you were there for years, right, working with Cheryl Curnow?
Well, I worked with her for 3 years through to the 93 election, and then was the party's campaign director for the 93 election, and we got a second senator in Queensland, and I stopped working for her. I mean, basically she decided it would be good if I didn't come back.
Why?
I suppose we sort of had a falling out, really, but I was party secretary as well at that stage, and Cheryl was very good at a lot of things, and people forget, given what happened subsequently, that she was extremely popular and quite good in many ways, but she was a real control freak. And in hindsight, it's part of why she asked me to be on staff, because I was also a party official and be helpful in terms of being able to control the party in Queensland, etc. And I did make the mistake of having a mind of my own. Wasn't realised that was not desired. So a couple of times I did stuff that didn't go down well, which I thought shouldn't matter, because it was stuff I was doing as party secretary, not as staff. I wasn't like she directed me to do stuff. But so, yeah.
So as campaign director in Queensland, at that time in the 90s, what kind of message did you put out for Queenslanders to appeal to them?
Oh, geez. 93 election was a really terrible one, actually, for the Democrats. We had a huge one in 1990 when Janine Haynes ran. This is all ancient history to most people. Most people you mention Janine Haynes don't even know who she is, but she was the first female leader of a parliamentary political party. She was leader of the Democrats in the mid-80s when Don Chipp retired, and she ended up becoming hugely popular. And when she first got the role, people thought, oh, this is just a gimmick, and the Democrats were all about Don Chipp the same way as people said the Greens were all about Bob Brown. But it ended up she became more popular than Don Chipp ever did, and she tried to switch from being in the Senate to run and win a seat in the House of Representatives, which has some particular resonance for me 30 years later, obviously. And she ended up not succeeding, but she came very close and got a huge vote, and a big vote for the Democrats, biggest vote they ever got, and bigger than the Greens have still ever got since. That was a huge election, but then because she didn't win, and I think there was always this thing of, oh, she doesn't win, she'll go back and come back again and go back into the Senate. And she said, no, I said I wasn't going to, and I didn't. So everyone went, So this, ironically, hugely successful election, except your leader lost, and then really didn't cope well with that, the parliamentarians, and had some division and stuff, and a pretty awful division, actually. And so their 93 election was a disaster, but we won an extra seat in Queensland, so that was a little small positive in the midst of a shocker. The worst one they'd had to date, actually, to that time. So there wasn't really much of a message at all beyond the, we're still, that third-party insurance umpire in the Senate, watchdog against the excesses of the big parties, that sort of stuff. The next one in 96, when Cheryl Kernot was leader by then and ran much more strongly on her brand and her support, still ran with a Keep the Bastards Honest slogan, but much more of a strident, these people are bastards type of vibe to it. And it was, ironically, even though that was an old slogan of Don Chips, it had never been used as an election slogan, and so it had just been something people had said, but this one we actually put it up on posters, and it sounds very quaint now, but even in 1996, people would ring in and complain about how rude it was to have the word bastards on the poster. And, hearing it on TV, because you'd actually say it, and, this nice, lovely Cheryl Kernot saying bastards, it's just not on, it's not appropriate. Couldn't believe it.
Was 96 the first election you ran in?
No, I was still a staffer then, at that stage staffer for the other Queensland Democrat senator, and Cheryl Kernot was leader. And God, now you said it though, you're right. Your research is better than my memory. I was a candidate. It wasn't the first time I was a candidate. I ran in 1991 in the council, Brisbane City Council elections. The Taringa ward, which isn't there anymore, but it'd be the area covered by Paddington ward these days, which all this time later is on the verge of being won by the Greens at next year's council elections, a really good chance, and came quite close last time actually, but did all right in 91 in Taringa. Can't remember what I got, but was that 17-18%, something like that, and then ran in the state election in probably 95, I think. But yeah, so 96 I did run as a candidate. Thank you. You are right. For the seat of Brisbane, which I'm running for again now. That was the election that Keating got wiped out. Democrats did quite well, but we were really just focusing on the Senate again then. I mean, the Janine Haynes aberration, if you like, of all or nothing tilt for the House of Reps. I guess because she didn't succeed, people didn't try that again. So it was mostly about the Senate for the Democrats, and in the Reps it was just Labor wipeout. But my preferences, or the preferences of people who voted for me anyway, in 96 helped Labor keep a hold of the seat of Brisbane then. It was one of only two in all of Queensland. They lost all the rest, only had 2 seats left. That was the election Pauline Hanson got elected as well.
So standing as an actual candidate is kind of a different step to all the other, activist and political work you'd done before, because running as a candidate, you're the public face. You're out there. As you've acknowledged before, you're a bit of a quiet person. How did you kind of reconcile that, knowing that you need a certain kind of charisma? You need to be able to face the public and put on a bit of a show like that.
Yeah, well, I think I've probably spent my whole political career trying to prove you don't need charisma by definition, seeing I don't have any. I've probably just proven the opposite, depending on how people might assess how successful or otherwise I've been. But I don't know. I mean, I think it's still a secondary role, I suppose, being a House of Reps candidate in that context. It's different now because the seat, this time around running for Brisbane, we can win it. So it's a very different dynamic, whereas there is much more, running to wave the flag and give people somebody to vote for and all that sort of stuff. But, you still need to talk to people and stuff like that. So, but, I was a social worker, so I suppose I can talk to people. It's actually not, because you've got a context within which to talk, and it's not personal stuff, it's policy stuff. It's not hard for me because it's stuff I'm interested in, and I'm interested in other people's views. And the part that I love about being a candidate is not that I get to spruik about all my great ideas, it's that you get to hear what people think. and much more opportunity to hear people's ideas and views and feelings, not all of which are positive, obviously, but a lot of mine aren't positive either, so that's all fine. And to me, that's always been the biggest failing of our political system, and it's one thing I wish the Democrats could have done better, and it's one thing I wish the Greens could do better as well, is actually more genuinely engage and involve people in political processes and more genuinely take on board and give them more of a say over issues that affect them. We try to do that sometimes, but I think we could do it a hell of a lot better, and need to have a better recognition that we can do it a lot better. But anyway, yeah, so it's elections aren't just going out there and, throwing to switch to vaudeville, as Paul Keating once said. It's about, it sounds corny, but it is that chance for a bit more of a conversation amongst the community about what they want and what they're unhappy with and that sort of thing. But obviously it's framed around policies, and some of that is, a lot of it is a selling job or a marketing job, I suppose, about why this is good. But it's, I feel anyway, it's more meaningful and works better if it's, your idea of the policies you pick is at least in part meant to be there's something you think people are wanting or needing, or you're going to make the case as to why they need it. But, it's like any conversation really. If you just yell at somebody, or maybe it's about, you're trying to convince somebody that Sisters of Mercy is a good band, you're not going to succeed just by yelling at them and saying, no, they're bloody good, you're a fool. Your band's crap, my band's great. You talk through what's good about it and maybe listen to some of their reasons why, and then, counter with something else, or maybe admit that some of their songs are actually a bit shit and perhaps the singer is a dick, but that's beside the point. It's more of a conversation. You're more likely to get somewhere than if you just hammer somebody. But, it does help to have some good material as well.
Did you ever go through any media training when you were running as a candidate? Did anyone try and zhuzh you up a bit for the public?
Not really. I did some after I was already in Parliament, which is probably a bit late, really. But, you get a bit of style advice now and then, but sometimes you take it, sometimes you don't.
The purple shirts, was that your idea?
I guess so. It wasn't like a, cunningly calculated plan to develop some personal brand. I think I just liked purple.
Well, that's the thing that sets you apart.
Well, more people should like purple, I think, but it does seem to be something that's stuck in people's minds as a thing. So, and I guess because it's authentic anyway, and it's a mighty fine colour, with, in all its varying shades, then can't be anything but a good thing, really.
So once you were elected to the Senate, what is your lifestyle like when you're a senator? How much time do you have to spend in Canberra? What do you do?
Yeah. It'd be good if there was ways to make people more aware of what politicians do, in part to make sure they do it properly. The Parliament side of it depends a bit from year to year, but maybe 17, 18 weeks a year you're there, sort of Monday to Thursday. Parliament sits normally. You have committee hearings on top of that. People might have heard of Senate estimates hearings, which just you have a few weeks where you question public servants about what's in the budget or all the various programs that the government runs. And, that can be really important in terms of genuinely extracting information. You don't get much opportunity to genuinely extract information in Parliament itself, but some of those committee hearings you can. And then other Senate inquiries around the place, which often hold public hearings here and there. And then I guess if you're a senator, at least it's different when you're in a smaller party, I guess, because there's a smaller number of you. If you're in a larger party, you're a senator, you've also got lots of people in the House of Reps who've got their own local seats. So the idea of the senator having to cover the whole state themselves doesn't really exist, whereas, Democrats or Greens, when there's only one or two, well, the Greens have never had more than one in Queensland. The Democrats had two Queensland senators for a decade or so. But, it's a big it's a big state. Plus, because you're a small party, you're basically like a shadow minister for various issues. The one I got most heavily immersed in was immigration and refugee stuff, but I also had environment stuff and social security, social welfare sort of stuff, and housing and Aboriginal issues for a while, and animal welfare issues, and LGBTIQ issues. If you're doing that, or you're like the national spokesperson, you've got to meet with people around the country. So you could be away every single day of the year easily enough. There's no shortage of things to do. It's really trying to make those decisions about what to focus on and how much time to spend on it.
I guess being a politician in Canberra is it's a FIFO job essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing the number of people that assume that you live in Canberra, you get elected, you live in Canberra, and then just occasionally you'd happen to be in Brisbane. The number of times people would see me in Brisbane and go, "Oh, you're just, in town, are you?" I'm like, I live here. I've always lived here. So you fly in, and usually you get out as soon as you can. And I mean, Canberra, the town, gets a bad rep because of Canberra Parliament House, but Canberra, the city or town, seems quite nice, but you've got too much else to do, and after the novelty wears off, sticking around for its own sake is not really worth the bother. So it is a fly in, fly out thing in terms of Parliament House itself.
Does it get lonely there?
It depends what type of person you are, I suppose. There's certainly no shortage of people wanting to talk to you, and I guess the interesting thing for me, both the times I was in the Senate, because the time I came in the first time in 1997 was when Cheryl Kernot, out of absolutely nowhere, quit the Democrats and joined the Labor Party, which was just an absolute shock and completely unprecedented, and it's never happened since. And it's hard to see it ever happening again because it didn't work out terribly well. But either way, it was absolutely out of left field. So I filled her vacancy, but it was, it was literally 1 week just churning through my roles in the party and staff roles and, planning for, next election in a couple of years' time and all that sort of stuff. And then, within 2 days, I wasn't sworn in within 2 days, but within 2 days, she'd quit. Meetings had happened, had been decided I'd fill the spot, etc. So it was a very sudden shift. Having said that, I was already a parliamentary staffer and pretty immersed in that sphere, so it was a bit like a workplace where somebody quits suddenly and you've got to shift into a different role. It wasn't, suddenly waking up and discovering you've got to do brain surgery or whatever. But it was sudden, and the same, I guess, the second time around when Larissa Warder discovered she was Canadian, even though it took freaking 4 months before the High Court finally confirmed what was already known 4 months earlier. Everybody knew that I was going to be back in there again. So the change in the way people treat you is really obvious, because 1 week you're just this, schmo that nobody's really paying any attention to, and the next week all these people are going, "Hey, how's it going? Good to see you. I want to tell you about this thing. I'll tell you about this thing," So it was just, and that's understandable. I'm not trying to have a go at people, but you just really notice, and in terms of the job, that's understandable, but the other part of it, of course, is all these people suddenly start treating you like you're special and trying to, like you're somebody important, and it's an important role, but, as a person, as a human being, you're no more important and no more better than you were the week before. It's just suddenly everybody wants to blow smoke up your ass, so it was really very starkly apparent both times. In regards to that, and that's what happens to people, I guess because it was so sudden in my circumstances, it was more obvious, but you can see, when people in that atmosphere, that's why I say it wouldn't matter where you were. Even if you stayed at home and didn't go to Parliament House at all, you'd still perpetually be reinforced about how you're supposed, you're some big shot super guru person that's, more significant than everybody else and more important than everybody else, and what you do is more important than anything else and all that sort of stuff. So that's the air that politicians breathe all the time, and when they're in Parliament House, it's sort of just concentrated times 10. And everybody else there, all the staffers, all the press gallery, everything else, all breathe the same air of self-importance. So,
did you make a genuine friendships with people who are not on your political side?
I often wonder about the definition of the word friend. It's one of those words that has multiple meanings to different people. So that's more of a general comment, and I'm not always sure how well that... If my sense of that word means the same as what it does to other people, because I see other people using it in contexts where it doesn't make much sense to me. And there is that fabulous old political saying, which I thought Paul Keating said, but I think it's actually older than him, about, if you want a friend in politics, get a dog, which sounds harsh, but I think it's also leaving the harsh interpretation to one side. It's more, you're not there to make friends, and if you make your decisions internally in an organisation or whatever based on, sticking because someone's your friend, then you're not doing it for the right reasons. Mind you, I saw a lot more bad decisions made out of hatred rather than friendship. People opposing something because they wanted to stop somebody they hated from getting somewhere or whatever. It's part of what ruined the Democrats, I'd have to say. It wasn't friendships, it was hatreds. But I don't know. I mean, Claire Moore, who's a Labor senator, she's just retiring at this election. I get on really well with and have huge admiration for. She's one of the few federal parliamentarians I do have, genuine admiration for how she goes about things as well as everything else. But part of that was wasn't because of Parliament. It's because I'd seen her around at all the rallies and stuff around town and meetings and forums and consultation sessions and all that. And she'd go to things even when she wasn't speaking at them and all that stuff, and she used to be at them before she was in Parliament. I know she'll still be at them when she's not in Parliament. So it's more just recognition, just someone who's genuinely about working with and supporting people in the community rather than, using the role to showboat or get off on it.
Is it difficult to get along with people outside of the chamber when your own values are so radically different to their values and you have to work together, like if you're on a committee or something?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it's a bit of a danger, though, because it can become a bit of a club. And some of them I've heard talk about it as a club, and say we should all get on because even, we're all part of the parliamentary club. But to me, that's part of that bubble that, we're all in our own little club over here and our private club being special. And that really feeds into that idea that all the criticisms is all theatre. I mean, and some of them undoubtedly believe a lot of that. They'll say the most terrible things and quite personal attacks on people and go, oh, that's all just part of the game. I hate that phrase. I really hate it. I've always hated it. So I heard someone use it in my very, very early days and thought that's wrong. It's a bit like the word friend. People use it in different ways, but it's still just resonates. Everything that's wrong about the place is people treat if there's one frickin' role, there's one job, it's not a bloody game. It's that. But people just get off on the contest, and I can see why they do. I mean, I got pulled into it a bit, I feel, the first time around, but this stuff. Christopher Pyne just the other day with his farewell speech, and everyone goes, oh, it's not going to be the same, what a guy, and it's like bullshit, and I don't know, I mean, he's a pleasant sort of chap and stuff, and more personable than plenty, certainly more personal than I am, but when they're doing all that stuff, there's got to be a line there. I mean, you still work with people because you've got to work with them, and you're still, in the Senate in particular, you've got to, no one party's got a majority. You've got to work with things. You've got to come to agreement on amendments, on legislation, on whether to have a committee inquiry and where to have hearings for the committee inquiry, on who to call as witnesses. You've got to work together as adults. That's fine, but it's like any workplace. You can have people there you loathe and detest, and people there who are completely contemptible, disgusting human beings that would be better off if they didn't exist, but they're there, so you've got to work with them. And in that sense, it's not hard because it's just the way it is. It's like having to clean shit off the toilet. You've got to clean it off because it's there. It mightn't be pleasant, but it's not hard. It's a bit different to forming friendships, I think. I don't know, it's a hard one. It's a real fuzzy line there because it's much better to have an atmosphere of working together where you can not be loathing and detesting everybody, but at the same time, I felt this very much more the second time around because I feel, having done your research, you would presumably have seen me say this, politics is so much worse now, and that, the deliberate knowing destruction of the planet and the deliberate infliction of horrendous suffering on people, the launching of the frickin' Iraq war, which, back then I let myself kid myself into thinking it was, bad decision done for the right reasons or something, rather than a disgracefully cynical, politically driven act that, killed hundreds of thousands of people and is still reverberating for the rest of the frickin' century. They're war crimes, They are war crimes. So, there's got to be that bit of your head going, yeah, well, you're a nice, charming guy, but you're also a freaking war criminal, and probably part of how you get away with being a war criminal is because you're bloody charming. Although, I'm not sure some of those involved in sending us to war in Iraq were terribly charming. But so, you still be polite, but yeah, people shouldn't get a free pass when they're, the stuff we're doing now to sole parents and unemployed people, and it was always bad, and it was always deliberate, demonising of dole bludgers, etc. But it's just out of control, and they know it, and they don't care. So, a bit hard to like people like that. I don't want to like people like that. Don't like even liking the idea of liking people like that. But we still need to have to be in a peaceful, civilised society. So it's an interesting challenge.
Working within the team of the Democrats, did you find, or any of your own personal values ever really challenged with what you had to do for the sake of the team?
Very rarely. A long time ago now. In fact, the GST decision of the majority of Democrat senators to support the GST, which is now, mists of time. Most people don't know what you're talking about. 20 years ago next month, that was, May 1999. That was challenging. I mean, that was one where people's motivations were driven as much by personal loyalties rather than anything else, unfortunately. But plus, people getting too caught up in the game. Short-term, cunning plans rather than long-term, what are we actually here for? And also, party that's supposed to be about valuing and listening to and involving its membership. But anyway, that's different to the question you asked mostly. There was never, having to vote for something in the Senate that I disagreed with vehemently. The main examples were more internal administrative decisions, and in hindsight, the ones where I thought, that I should have had more courage then, and that ironically one does link to the GST, because I remember way back, because GST had been an issue back in the 93 election when Paul Keating won the unwinnable election against John Hewson, and John Hewson ran on the GST, and the Democrats were sidelined that election as part of why it was such a bad one, because Keating had basically said, if you elect the Liberals, Labor will support this in the Senate. So, you can't just elect the Liberals and then hope the Democrats will stop it in the Senate. He made it an all or nothing, which is a very big gamble, but very smart, really smart move politically, and totally sidelined the Democrats' whole, will be your safety net thing, because it just made us irrelevant on the big issue of the moment. But since then, after Howard got in eventually, there was, view in some of those in the Democrats that we needed to sharpen up our tax policy and have a more clear position on GST. And there was an absolutely explicit decision made by key people in starting that whole process, which was consultation with all the members and a ballot of members with a range of options about, we used to send round survey ballot papers, paper ballot papers, and, do you support this type of tax or that type of tax, and option A, B and C, all that sort of stuff.
This was sent out to the rank and file members?
Yeah, it's part of what really attracted me to the Democrats. Members got to say. Of course, the key thing is who decides the questions, not getting to vote on the questions, which is obvious in hindsight, but I was a bit slow. And there was a very explicit decision, because I heard people take it, have the most detailed survey they like on the tax policy, but not to have a straightforward, do you support a GST or not? There was a million other options all over the place, but no, because they knew the members would say no, and they wanted to keep the flexibility. And, this wasn't a parliament, this was a party officials with parliamentary input knowledge or whatever, and it was before I was even in the Senate, so I was just whatever I was, state president or something in Queensland and some other role. I still heard it all there and went along with it, thought it was, clever politics, etc. Sort of all my fault really in the end, because I'm sure if I'd just said, if I'd blown the whistle on that one way or another, it would have been in there as a question and would have got voted down, and the whole thing would never have happened. So it's my fault you got a GST, even though I voted against it in the Senate. Having said that, I didn't realise. It was another interesting experience because the Democrats' Senate team, there's 7 of us, never expected we'd have the say on it. It was an independent guy from Tasmania, Brian Harradine, who had the balance power, and everybody assumed he'd just do some deal, amendments here and there, and get some money for Tasmania or something like he'd done with part privatising Telstra, extra phone booths and call centre workers in Tasmania and stuff like that. Everybody assumed that. So government never came near us, didn't talk to us. Meg Lees had never even met John Howard. And then Brian Harradine stood up and went, nope. And so suddenly, Howard or Peter Costello or someone's on the phone going, hey, how you doing? And, within 3 weeks, we'd gone from, making a million arguments about why this was bad and why it needed changing and 5 million amendments to supporting something with a bunch of amendments, but nowhere near the 5 million. That's a symbolic figure, by the way, not a literal one. But yeah, all the way through and without betraying confidences, there was, a few times where people explicitly said, oh, we won't support it unless this happens, and we won't support it unless that happens. And this is included, so you sort of stay. In hindsight, it was clearly just a tactic to keep me in the tent, and Natasha Stott-Despoja as well, until we were so far along that it was too late. So if I'd had more awareness and perhaps a bit less trust, also then could have called it out earlier and just blown it all up. So twice I could have stopped it and didn't, even though I voted against it. But anyway.
Besides being solely responsible for the introduction of a GST, do you have any other major regrets but like ones you reasonably think you could have foreseen from your time in the Senate? Not of the sort I think you're getting at. And, the GST ones, I suppose, were more like if I'd been smarter or if I'd known more, or if I'd been more assertive or whatever, things might have been different. But having said that, I think there were broader underlying issues with the long-term viability of the Democrats. Things may have ended up where they ended up, roughly anyway. Look, the main thing is more a broader view that the thing I was mentioning before, the challenge of deciding what to spend your time on, and because there's no end to the number of things you can do, you can work on. I did too many things that I thought I'd enjoy rather than things that needed doing, which doesn't mean I went to a lot of parties or anything, but just, when you're deciding, oh, this will be good or that'll be good, and, I don't want to get all, hair shirt about it, but I still think, going to conferences where somebody's, there's a really interesting speaker you'd really like to meet or whatever, which is all very good, and it's not like it's a bad thing to do, but there's much more just genuinely community level, grassroots sort of stuff that I think I should have spent more time doing. Which is a bit of that bubble thing, I guess, talking about, it's not just the bubble of Parliament House, it's the bubble of people in that sphere, it's the bubble of the establishment, the people in the institutions that are part of the establishment, all the big organisations, all the big, the academics, the think tanks, there's that whole swirling world of people that all, go around talking with each other the whole time and meeting with each other at all sorts of events and things, and, it has its links down into the real world, but nowhere near as strong a links as they should be. And, people in positions like politicians in particular, who are actually, employed as representatives, should be focusing on getting more of those links happening to the community rather than, staying in that separate space. Do you think, is there anything that can be done structurally to the way our democracy works to get politicians doing more of that actual representative work rather than being in the bubble?
Well, I suppose in theory the way it should work is people give more of an idea that that's what they want and be more likely to vote for people who offer that, and then, the more people that do that, the more votes they get, the more others will start doing the same. But it doesn't, it's, there's an element of that in there, I suppose, but yeah, to suggest that's just the way it'll all work out of some nice theoretical magic of democracy is a bit naive. Although I do think, it's part of, and it's finding the right words for saying that sort of thing in a way that actually has meaning for most people, because most people are just disconnected from politics and think it's not something they can have any say in and feel fairly disillusioned with it and prefer to do other things where they feel they can have, make the world a better place. That's those that aren't totally immersed in just, surviving and getting food on the plate and keeping a roof over their head and those sorts of things, which, helps make the world a better place in its own way. But, look, I think, actively disempowering the entrenched institutions, and that includes some of the think tanks and others that are on, they've got their own business model that works perfectly well for them, and, they've got a role to play, but they're still far too influential and far too removed from just reality, I think, day-to-day reality. Early on I had some hope. I used to try, when things like, when I've things like blogging and stuff like that came up, and some of those ideas of the internet being able to be used to genuinely connect with people more directly, and a lot of them were shown to be illusory, and of course, not surprisingly, corporate business models and political campaigning models got into that space and distorted it the way they distort everything else. But I think there is still a lot of scope there. I mean, I think a really interesting situation at the moment with, this talk about so-called fake news and, misuse of social media to influence elections and all that sort of stuff, and all the not so much the trolls per se, but all the bots and Twitter and Facebook and all of that are quite clearly there, pumping out. It's not whether it's fake news or not. I mean, Murdoch empire was built on fake news, so it's hardly a new thing, but the pushing of lines, it's not about whether it's fake or not, it's the framing. I think there's an interesting space there that's not being explored about, if you had a genuinely open source model that was government funded but not government controlled, so it wasn't government controlling what's going to be on there, so people could genuinely use it as a forum for information and decision making. It didn't have any of that advertising model, and had enough people there with enough tech knowledge, and I'm not one of them, but I know they exist, that could do a reasonable job of filtering out the attempts to pervert and distort that, so it was much more of a genuine town hall type of thing. I think if government got in behind that and resourced it, but didn't control it, and there was genuine privacy protections in there, there's actually a lot you could do in that space. I think the biggest thing you can do for enabling better participation, though, in all sorts of things, not just Parliament, but all sorts of things, is to ensure people's basic needs are met. Because if you're stressed about losing your house, you're not really going to be engaging much in the debate about, the tax model or whatever. And there's always going to be a ton of issues that a lot of people don't want to engage with, but the main thing is that they have the opportunity to, and that those that are engaged are properly informed. And, we can do way much better with that. There's just no political will or interest in doing so, I think. Even people that talk about participatory stuff usually still have an idea in their head that, they know best, and really just, leave it to me and our mob, and we're good, that mob's terrible, but we're good, and put us in there and we'll do it better. And, I'm sure if the Greens were put in there, we would do it better, but we'd still stuff up a lot of things much more unless we did it whilst, properly engaging and listening to and being driven by the community. I mean, the best example for me is to point to the worst, which is, how obviously catastrophically parliamentary processes have failed Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. And, you don't need to do too much historical study, but the more you do, the more it repeats itself over and over and over again of, we know best. And, maybe you could try that once or twice and assume maybe they do know best, but clearly we don't, because we've fucked it up a million times. Although that's assuming people actually do want to fix it, which is another, they do want to improve things, which is, perhaps a debatable question, but plenty of people have genuinely tried, and it's always been we know best. And, the capacity of our political systems to operate in a way that was genuinely informed and even co-driven by First Nations people. The very concept is so alien to many in the political system that they just can't even contemplate even something as simple as that idea that came out of the statement of Uluru about a parliamentary voice. Wasn't, I mean, some of it was deliberately misrepresented, but I have no doubt for a chunk of people in that whole system, they can't contemplate how that could work in anything other than a symbolic or token way, because that would mean giving over power, which is, it's a foreign language. It's not. It's an alien language. It's an alternative universe. It's the dark side. Something, you probably have a better analogy, but whatever. Something or other where what's one of those alternative universes, like in the new Star Trek, where they flip out into the antimatter universe or the whatever.
The one where they all have goatees?
Yeah, something like that.
When you took over leadership of the Democrats, did you go in with ideas of how to open it up like that? Having gone through the issue of the GST, which it sounds like was a bit disillusioning, did you have ideas of how to improve internal processes?
Yeah, somewhat. I guess, it was another thing that came about not by design. It's like, the party shifted to Natasha Stott-Despoja as leader, which was very clearly member-driven and very clearly a bunch of things, but a core part of it was the members saying, that you may have had the best intentions, but the GST thing was a mistake. Sorry about that. And we want to go with Natasha. And then, majority of the MPs still decided they didn't and blew it all up. Or rather ironically, blowing it all up without actually having someone else in place to take over. So a bizarre scenario of, majority of the party room blowing up the leadership, and then the only two people standing for the leadership were the two people that supported the person that got rolled. It was pretty weird. So, it wasn't planned. And my main immediate focus was just to try and, get us all working together again and, coherent, and then try and rebuild, more of that participatory structure. But, I guess that stuff takes a lot of time and resources, I might say, and it's disappointing, really. I mentioned before about Democrats in the old days used to mail out paper surveys and paper ballots, and on policy it'd just be so much easier to do that now in modern internet land. But we succeeded in the sense of getting back together to focusing as a coherent unit and having an agreed policy agenda, and people stop abusing each other and all that sort of thing. But we never rebuilt the public support, so it was always, that was the death blow really when Natasha's leadership got rolled, got ended. There was no more second chances, I think, and from the public. And by that stage as well, the Greens had developed as a bit more of a coherent organisation and party, and they occupied so much of the same space that, why would you go with this dysfunctional rabble? And there's another mob there, fresh and growing and somewhat more cohesive to shift your support to.
How did you attempt to deal with it when the Greens, they were muscling in on the left-wing territory the Democrats had?
Yeah, it was pretty hard. There's a lot of examples in politics where the fiercest battles are between parties that are closest, the Libs and Nationals being the obvious one, where you're competing for the same sort of turf. You can actually end up, getting a lot more ferocious. And it was really unfortunate. I can't see any way it could have been avoided, because you are two organisations that are separate, and you're both, your objectives to build your vote. So you take it from the areas nearest, and, it's bad luck for the other party, really. But there were attempts all the way along, quite a number, even from the very earliest days. There was actually a ballot at one stage about possibly exploring a merger between Democrats and Greens. There was various meetings at various levels about alliances and collaborations and cooperations and stuff. I remember one in 95 trying to decide, the state election, that we just run in different seats so we're not competing directly. Those sorts of things didn't work, but we explored it, or half worked. nothing worked that election. That was 98. It was, sorry. That was the one Hanson, One Nation won 11 seats. So whether the Democrats got 2% and the Greens got 1.8, or vice versa, was sort of a bit redundant when One Nation was getting 20% and 11 seats. Put everything in perspective. But yeah, there've been a lot of attempts, and I was certainly one of those that was always looking for ways to work together, because it seemed such a waste of energy to be basically just battling for the same seats. But, you still had to do your role, and I guess when I was leader it was particularly challenging in 04 election, which was the Mark Latham election, and Bob Brown was the Greens leader, so yeah, it was pretty hard. And part of your product differentiations to highlight the differences, and there's not many, so you magnify the ones that are there. And yeah, it could get quite bitter on both sides. You'd see that now all the time online with some of the spats between Green supporters and Labor supporters. We're both competing for votes. When you're talking about the general public, most people, even if they're long-time voters for one party or whatever, they're not tribalists in that sense of, fighting to the death for their team or whatever. Most people are more nuanced than that.
What was it like for you personally, being the leader of a federal political party?
I don't know. That same thing, you're in a workplace and someone quits a role suddenly and you go into it. I suppose because I've never really... I know some people have a very clear goal and they think, I want to do that, and everything I do, I'm aiming towards that, and this is what I'm going to do when I get there. Whereas I've very much more been, I'll do this and see where it leads, and then this thing happens and that means you're doing this, and that's sort of interesting. And I still have ideas about what I think needs to be done, stronger and stronger ideas the older I get, but various positions are just vehicles for doing that, rather than things to get excited about in their own right. Maybe it's the benefit of being perpetually depressed and listening to lots of gloomy music, but any sort of position or success that seems like it's worth celebrating is inevitably going to get surpassed by something else and, crumble to dust fairly quickly as the relentless march of time rolls its way onwards. So I usually don't get too worked up about those short-term things.
You strike me as a pretty humble person, but was there anything at all that kind of tickled your ego about, walking into a room and being the leader and having people want things that you can give them?
There might have been, but I would have worked pretty hard on suppressing it. And I guess by that stage I was more conscious of that problem I've mentioned of people getting way too overfilled with their self-importance. And if you're enjoying yourself, it probably means you're not focused on what you need to be focused on. So, it was also in not very pleasant circumstances and generally in a period of pretty dire situation for the party, so it didn't really feel like something to celebrate anyway. I mean, I wanted to do it. I wouldn't have nominated him. Didn't want to do it because I thought I could help repair things, and in as much as things were repairable, I think I did an okay job, but I never repaired the vote, which is obviously the core performance criteria. I don't think anyone else could have either. I think that was all done by then. So maybe if Natasha had come back, perhaps might have been a temporary little boost, but beyond that. So yeah, it wasn't really fun.
Were you in an okay state mentally at that point?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I don't, it wasn't until it all finished, that election was not a good one. We lost all the seats that were up, but could have done things differently and better, but I don't think we would have had much of a different outcome. And then had another 3 years in the Senate still, and I think still did some worthwhile things in the community and supported a lot of people, but was always with that prospect of losing at the end of it all and the party disappearing, and you still do all you can, and I think we actually did moderately well. I always use that analogy of the Bruce Willis movie, Sixth Sense. You're already dead, you just didn't realise it. People just were literally I remember a couple of times explicitly at rallies and things, and be talking with people, and they'd say, whilst I was still in the Senate before the election, we hadn't lost yet, and people would say, "Oh, it's a real shame about the Democrats. It was, pity you were really good. Shame you're not around anymore." And I'm like, I am right here. We are around. We're still here. And they're like, "Oh yeah, I know, but you know what I mean, though." It was pretty depressing. But you're in the middle of it, so I guess you don't have time to get. It's so full on. I always liken it to, rafting whitewater rapids. You don't have time to think about being depressed because you're too busy, navigating your way around the next boulder. Or, it's a bit more planned than that. That makes it sound like it's chaos and you're not controlling anything. But there's so many things happening, is I guess what I'm trying to say. So it wasn't until it all stopped, and then you just sit and survey the wreckage.
Is it harder to deal with the self-inflicted boulders that you put on the raft, like the Genie Ferris incident?
I don't know. I mean, that was one of the curious things about political activity, I suppose, is people only see tiny bits of it, and the bits they do see tend to be extremely distorted, and they only remember tiny bits, and that's often very little reflection of reality. So there's a lot of things you can't control, including how people perceive you. A lot of people put a lot of effort into trying to shape public perceptions of them, I guess. A bit like music scene sometimes. But yeah, like some other people in the music scene, the other people don't bother terribly. You just, this is hard enough work as it is without bothering about how people think of you too much. I mean, I'm not trying to dismiss all that. Obviously, you do what you can to be seen in a good light, but I think the best you can do is, be genuinely yourself, and it's other people can do it. I guess I just can't do it. It's too disconnected from reality to try and go down that path. There's all sorts of things to do differently, every day. People always say that thing, especially politicians always say, no regrets, I'd do it all again, you wouldn't change a thing. And I get what people mean. They mean, I'm not going to beat myself up about stuff, but I think it's the stupidest saying ever, because, what is the point of learning from stuff? Of course you'd do things differently. I'd do many things differently. But similarly, I also usually don't, the things I've mentioned about, if I'd said something earlier about stuff with the GST or whatever, I don't beat myself up about it particularly. I just note it because it's a learning experience, I suppose. It's something I wish I'd done differently, but, I wish I hadn't given up learning the piano as well, but, I did, and I'm just too lazy to learn it again now.
I suppose the GST thing was a lesson that you would have learned about working with other people within your party, but when you got drunk after the last day of Parliament and stole bottles of wine from the Libs, that's a pretty clear own goal. What did you learn? What did you have to put in place yourself after that incident?
The immediate thing was not to drink. It's difficult to talk about that incident because the person involved isn't alive anymore, so elaborating any further on it feels a bit unfair. I wish I'd said more at the time about things that had happened, but I didn't. So one of the interesting aspects of that incident was the very large number of people that, including people that didn't, well, obviously most people weren't there. Some people were there and know what happened and didn't happen, but the very large number of people, I suppose, that gave messages along the effect of supportive messages, I guess I'd say. A lot of different ways they framed them, but, saying that they didn't see that as representative of me or whatever. And, the main thing with not drinking for a bunch of time after that was just to, demonstrate, seriousness about contrition, I suppose.
Do you think you actually had a problem with alcohol before then, or was it just a way of, absolutely making sure that you would never put yourself in that kind of situation again?
Oh, no, I had a huge problem with it. One of my psychiatrists used to say, as people always demur about whether they've got an alcohol problem or not, because it's got all this stigma attached to it. So the simplest thing, if alcohol's ever caused you a problem, you've got an alcohol problem, and it doesn't need to be something like that. It can just be, insert own experience here. I guess everyone can think of something. So, it's a problematic drug for a lot of people. It certainly was with me and has been since, etc. But part of navigating through life, I suppose, when the pros and cons of, having reasonably persistent chronic depression is it puts things in context a bit more. So some apparent disasters seem less disastrous and supposed triumphs are less triumphant, which has its pluses and minuses. But yeah, my main challenge has been navigating that really. So alcohol's a mechanism many people use, but it's not a wise one to use in any ongoing way anyway.
How did you get sober at the time?
This sounds like I'm being flippant, but I'm not. I just stopped drinking. It's something I've usually been able to do if I feel like there was a big enough reason. I don't know, a very different context, but it was a bit like going vegetarian or something. I just decided I should see if I could do this, and then I did it, and something in my brain just clicked in, and I don't know. I mean, I didn't drink at all when I was a bit ironic, really, through all those years we were talking about at university, etc., and at Triple Z, or any other drugs or whatever. And I don't particularly remember, like it wasn't some prurient thing, or this is wrong, or I'm against this, or I'm looking down on you people, or anything from my upbringing or anything really. It was just, I just didn't, and it didn't particularly occur to me to. Possibly it was my subconscious being very smart and finding a way to keep me away from all that stuff, which is, which has still been sufficiently smart in regards to every other drug, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, it's the same thing. I have no problem with other people taking any other drugs that they like, although I think people need access to information and, support services if they do need it, and need to make sure the drugs they're taking are actually the drugs they think they're taking. But, everybody's makeup's different, whatever that. So it may be that other drugs would have been good for me, but I suspect not. And I'm not likely to find out, I suspect, although who knows.
By the time the Democrats formally dissolved, had you been thinking about moving to the Greens for a while?
I had a bit in those final period of Parliament, and talking with people about, is it worth trying to do some sort of merger before what looked like the inevitable disappearance, and, maybe increase the chance of hanging on to those seats for, a progressive pro-environment party, but people weren't really into it, I guess, Probably too late anyway by then, but it was, still exploring, because I guess for me, I'd feel like, whether it's Democrats, whether it's the Greens, obviously you have a loyalty to the organisation you're part of and the people that have worked to build it up, but it's a vehicle for change. It's not an end in itself. It's not a cult. It's not a football club. I quite like cheering for a footy club and all that stuff, and that's just, fun thing about just sticking with your team no matter what. But, these are vehicles for social change, and if they don't work anymore, then they don't work. And it's sad, but because of a lot of people that have done a lot of things, but it doesn't mean that work's wasted. A lot of the work people did through the Democrats played their part alongside and intertwined with social movements to, get a lot of social change happening. I mean, the LGBTQ area is one I think of a lot. I don't think the Democrats get enough credit for it, but it's not really about taking credit. It's about the role people play and increasing understanding and building support for things. And we played a big role in just keep pushing away at that and supporting all the other people that were doing it. You could have done that in all sorts of other social groups as well, community groups alongside a political party, but I was doing it in a political party. Yeah, I guess it's the same thing with the Greens. It's a vehicle. It's the best vehicle at the moment by a long shot in the party political system. But, the party political system's pretty broken as well, so the people understandably sometimes put their energies elsewhere. The main decision for me when the Democrats folded and when I finished up in the Senate was whether to stay involved in electoral politics or whether to do something completely different. And I was possibly moving towards doing something different, but I hadn't ruled out joining the Greens. I had a fair bit of experience and knowledge, including what not to do. So wasn't averse to it, and a few people asked me if I would, so I did.
People seem to ask you to do a lot of things, and you seem to fall upwards a lot.
Yeah, I don't know. Been a few pretty major crashes for something. Descriptions of falling upwards, but I know what you mean. It's probably a good example, though. I mean, including in political parties, but elsewhere, particularly actually for, if you're wanting to get more people involved in political parties or other organisations that aren't the hyper-ambitious and the self-promoters and the psychopaths and the narcissists that infest party politics pretty badly, sort of moths to a flame, personality types to politics. They don't need asking. But a lot of people are waiting to be asked, often because they're thinking they're not good enough, or someone else will be better, or someone else wants to do it. Or they're just not the type to push themselves forward. So yeah, it's a reminder, it's good to ask people.
And maybe we should be giving these kind of positions more to people who aren't asking for it.
Yes, I think that would be good. Quite how you make that happen, I don't know. Have some secret test whether you ask people as part of the application whether they want to do the job, and if they say yes, then they can't do it. Which, people have said from time to time, only people who should be in Parliament are people that don't want to be there.
I was reading the other day the origin of the term Prime Minister was actually a pejorative, and that the job of having to wrangle all the other ministers was a job they gave to, the person lowest on the totem pole because it was such a thankless job.
Yeah, right. Hadn't heard that, but...
I'm not sure of the accuracy. I'm going to have to research that.
Interesting concept. I'm not sure I'd use the word thankless because you're perpetually being thanked by everybody and everybody telling you how great you are. But, there's aspects of it that are hard. I don't want to be as complete as possible, I suppose. And, the reputation of politicians is pretty low, quite deservedly, not quite as low as journalists, also deservedly. But so, you've got to wear some of that. But another real danger there that you see happen is people in that space just, building up a massive thick skin. You need a bit of a skin, but it gets too thick, you don't feel anything anymore and everything bounces off and you turn into all those people that are particularly loathe, but, they're the ones that can do the most terrible things to other humans because they're just, either they were sociopaths to start with or they've developed, such a rhinoceros hide that nothing gets through anymore as a defence mechanism perhaps, but, it is still meant to be about making things better for, the community and the planet, not, because it's fun.
Does stuff still get through to you when you're campaigning?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by get through. I don't get upset by terribly much externally. The stuff that mostly is the main stuff over forever, for decades, that is distressing is when you get attacked internally. Stuff externally doesn't particularly bother me because I try not to completely dismiss it because I think you always got to be open to criticism. But if it's just moronic trolling abuse, it doesn't. But the bits that get to you are the bits that are true. That's the stuff that gets to you. So the occasional criticisms about party or whatever, where you just I can't. I have trouble countering things that I know have significant truth to them. So you just sort of got to wear them and use them as motivation for improvement.
You've run as a candidate for the Greens a few times now, a few campaigns since you joined. What did you find different about the way Greens run their campaigns to the Democrats?
It's hard to say because they're different eras. Really, the Democrats are at the peak through into the sort of 80s and 90s, and Greens didn't really start getting a big head of steam. Got some people elected, but didn't really start getting a head of steam until this century. So, the nature of campaigns are different. There's a lot of focus now, quite rightly, on... the big difference is the Greens have got more capacity because it's a stronger party, really.
Stronger in what way?
It's got more members, it's got more resources, it's got more members of parliament across all the state parliaments. It actually doesn't... The number of senators the Greens have got now is the number I think the Democrats had at that party's peak as well of 9. But and, Greens have got a House of Reps MP, only one, but that's huge to have that beachhead. But obviously very keen to increase that 1 to more than 1. But in terms of the party more broadly, it's got way more resources, more staff, more money, more state MPs, more members, and a more bigger supporter base. And whilst it's far from perfect and there's still an imbalance, the technology is somewhat levels the play field somewhat in terms of databases and online communications and things like that, most of which wasn't really there in a meaningful sense. But the Greens rightly, at least in the lower house seats that we target, really hammer community grassroots campaigning and door knocking and all of that sort of stuff. And Democrats, we did do some door knocking, but we just didn't have the capacity and we didn't have the numbers. So that's sort of the big difference, is we've got more capacity, to really get out and connect with people rather than just, throw media releases out at the media and hope they run with some of them, or, other much more inefficient ways. Probably the biggest thing, but yeah, all the online stuff's very different, but that's because that wasn't around before, or nowhere near in the same way.
When we did have that big constitutional farce a couple of years ago, and as you said, Larissa Waters found out she was Canadian, you assumed her role as senator. Was it always the plan to serve until that got cleared up and have that position passed back to her?
No, I mean, there's no plan because it wasn't a planned event, obviously. Once I took on that role, and there was a 4-month gap with nobody in the position at all, and that was leading into the state election here in Queensland as well in 2017, which was a really big focus for us because we'd had a breakthrough in the council election in 2016 and winning a ward for the first time, which I think people down south didn't realise because councils down south are much smaller, and Greens have been on councils down south for ages, but Brisbane City Council's basically like a state electorate, the size of them. So it was a big breakthrough, and basically we put that whole shock to one side of the Scott Ludlam, Larissa Waters disqualifications and the big brawl that federal MPs had about school funding and kicking Lee Rhiannon out of the party room and all of that sort of stuff, which so much has happened since then that people have forgotten. But Queensland really just put all that to one side, and I did as well, even though I was basically just treading water waiting for the High Court to confirm. And we just focused on the state election because we felt we had a chance there as well in a few seats, and we had a breakthrough there as well, of course. And then we had, by that stage, getting through to starting to look at pre-selection for the next federal election. So it was only once I was in there and was experiencing it all and looking for, thinking about where might be best in terms of the political opportunities and I guess the momentum around movements for change, for progressive issues, and how we could maximise those, that I felt I could see a chance of winning a House of Reps seat. A long shot, but a plausible one, not a pretend one. And I guess it felt to me like that was worth going for. I mean, maybe because I'd already been in the Senate, so I didn't feel as driven to stay there, but I don't think so. I think definitely because I'd already been in the Senate, I could see the limitations of what you can achieve there. You can achieve a lot, and it's really important, don't get me wrong. We definitely need to hang on to that seat, but I guess, I knew almost certain Larissa would win the pre-selection if I didn't run, and I knew obviously she could do the job if she was back in there, so it seemed like, well, that, reverting back to that sort of pretty safe option and the obvious campaigning line of getting her back in the Senate, restoring the natural order of things, if you like, and having that bulwark against, One Nation and the growing reactionary forces on the right. And, I guess I'd do a Janine Haynes even, really. Maybe a few of those little echoes, I guess, appealed to me, of not in any putting my name in history or whatever, just like, that was such a pivotal moment and we fell short, and that, who knows what would have happened. But this would be a significant thing, and it was a real chance, I guess. So I felt, well, I could, focus on just trying to stick around in the Senate and, do a good job there. And I know I would have done a better job this time around than last time, and I think I did some good things even in the short period there. But the big things, it's bigger than the individual, all this stuff. I mean, hopefully that's come through in some of the stuff I've been saying. And, same as parties are vehicles for change, individuals, we can all be vehicles for change. And sometimes you're in a situation where you've got a chance of making something happen that nobody else can. So that's what this feels like, I suppose. It might not happen, of course, but it's a real chance, and it would be a significant positive impact if we could win that extra House of Rep seat. It would be big for Queensland in particular, and Brisbane.
So it's currently held by a Lib by a 6% margin, is it?
Yeah.
So what's the strategy? So at the moment, as of recording, I'm not sure when this will come out, but the federal election is yet to be called. But I would think it's probably going to be May.
May. Oh, it has to be May.
It has to be May.
Be May 11th or May 18th. I expect May 11th, but it's 5 weeks away.
So the seat of Brisbane, and was it in 2012 when you last ran for Parliament and you achieved, what was it, a 10% swing to the Greens?
2010 I ran for the seat of Brisbane. That was the Gillard election, so there was the big surge to Kevin Rudd, and then Labor had the first of their shatterings, and so Gillard was 2010, and there was a big surge to the Greens, but for a bunch of reasons. I think partly because Labor walked away, or Kevin Rudd walked away from climate change, and obviously the Greens very strong on that. So, but yeah, we got over a 10% swing. It was the second strongest swing of any Green seat in the country after Adam Bant. That was the election where he first broke through into Melbourne. Not saying that was all me, but I guess the fact that it was a bigger swing than anywhere else suggests that some of it was me, because we didn't have the capacity in 2010 to do all the door knocking and stuff that we're doing now. We really just covered the polling booths, and that was about it. So, I guess that experience, even, knowing what we're capable of doing now, campaigning on the ground, so we can win lower house seats. We won the council seat, we won the state seat. Seat of Brisbane I've run for before, and, we got a good swing when we barely campaigned at local level. And obviously we campaigned as a party, but the local on the ground campaigning was almost none.
Has there been like an event though for federal Labor you feel similar to Rudd walking away from climate change that you think will drive Labor voters specifically towards the Greens?
Well, there's two dynamics this time. I mean, one is a big difference. Obviously, we've got a Liberal government, not a Labor one. And when I first decided to have a shot at the House of Reps and the seat of Brisbane, it's also where I live and it's where I've lived all my life, so I know it very well. If I'm going to run anywhere, it'd be there. It's our strongest seat already in Queensland for the Greens. It's right near where we won the state seat of Maiwar. It's a Liberal seat. It used to be a traditional Labor seat right through till 2010. It was Labor for decades, apart from a brief period after the collapse of the Whitlam government. And then it's changed to Liberal just since 2010. So the area's changed. The natural Labor base there has been subsiding in state and council level as well as federal. The Green base has been increasing. The Liberal base, apart from pockets like Ascot, is not the same as some of these other safe Liberal seats like Ryan that have been just dyed-in-the-wool Liberal forever. There's more fluidity there as well, and a Liberal government on the nose. And when I first decided to have a shot at it and think it was plausible, this was January 2018, I think I decided, and announced it not long after that, and got pre-selected in March, and we've been campaigning literally 12 months. We started door knocking April 2018, and the Liberals were on the nose then, but that was before they did their explosion with Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison and everything else, and got rid of Turnbull. So they're 20 times more on the nose, at least in this seat anyway. So there's a big surge of people away from the Libs, and the big situation here, I guess, is whether those people will just default to Labor like people normally do when they're changing government, or whether they'll recognise that having a Green in there would provide something different. And if you look at some of the examples like the independents coming through, people point to Wentworth. It was a by-election, so it's a bit different, but that was 20% swing or something, only 6% here. And there's some similarities. The seat of Brisbane had the biggest vote in Queensland in favour of marriage equality, and about the fifth best in the country, I think. It's actually quite a progressive seat, even though it's held by the Liberals. It's got a very high proportion of renters. It's got significant inequality. It's got a lot of homelessness. It's got a lot of low-paid people, and it's not strong for Labor. And they're not campaigning. They're not targeting it. And the candidate, is a good guy, and he's doing his thing around the place. But understandably, they're putting their resources into seats which much tighter margins, and Peter Dutton's seat or seat at Petrie or Bonner.
Are the Liberals putting up much of a fight? Do they think you're a threat?
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, you'd have to ask them that, but I think quite clear. I mean, Trevor Evans is the Liberal member, and he's very clearly working hard. He's certainly not taking it for granted. And, I don't want to get into personal reflections on people. I'd just say, he's part of a Liberal government that's implemented all these horrendous destructive policies, and we need to get rid of the Liberals. So I have no doubt he knows that he's at risk, and, he's at risk from... It could go to Labor as well, somewhat by default, and when I say that, I don't mean to say that as a negative reflection on their candidate or anything, but just, if the natural swing, as it always used to be, of just, you want to get rid of the Libs, you vote Labor, you want to get rid of Labor, you vote Libs, because we've just had that two-party system in place for over 100 years. But, as we've shown in the state seat we won, or, we won a Liberal seat in Melbourne in the state election called Paran, which we then held. A seat of Ballina in the New South Wales election was a National Party seat. We won in 2015 and just held with an increased majority, so we can win seats that are held by the Conservatives. If people think we're running a strong campaign and we're a credible choice, and we've certainly been doing that. Really, really freaking hard. Exhaustingly hard campaign over a very long period of time. And we've had to just try and talk to as many people as possible. And once people, it's that human psychology, once people realise you can win, they're more likely to vote for you. And yeah, there's no doubt we can win, but whether we will, we'll see.
Do you think it's easier to win seats off the Liberals or Labor?
Every circumstance different. I mean, the original ones tended to win have been, obviously Adam Bance in Melbourne was a strong traditional Labor seat, and the same with the state breakthroughs in New South Wales and Victorian state parliaments were initially those. I think circumstances are changing though. Those were the best chances, best opportunities for the Greens 6 or 8 years ago. But I think now, as our broader base has built up, politics is fluid. People tend to talk about it as binary and left and right, and that's valid up to a point. But within those polls, there's a lot of things that shift, and the big things that shifted is a consensus around neoliberal economics, without sounding too nerdy, but it was actually Hawke and Keating that really drove that in, and then Howard turbocharged it. Primacy of the market and free market fundamentalism, and that's now completely failed and completely discredited. And that, to me, is a big default point, along with things like climate change, where Greens are clearly strongly against neoliberalism and against that sort of market-driven solutions, and recognise a strong role for government and recognise the need for strong action on climate. Libs are way in the other direction. Labor's sort of transitioning, but I think it's fair to say a bit of a foot in both camps along the way. And, they've got the institutional strength of being there for 100 years and all of those seats, so you can't just sweep that aside in a day under our electoral system anyway. But where there's enough, clear alternative for people, and it's relevant for particular parts of the communities as it is. And I think we've got some other strings to our bow as well that we can build on in the future that perhaps aren't as pivotal now in some of the seats we're winning, but I think we've got a lot more scope for expansion if we keep our shit together, and which is, no sure thing. But if we can, coherently function as an organisation as we get bigger and under some of the challenges and threats from, the institutional forces that are under threat and are lashing back, there's opportunities there. But, the immediate thing is whether we can break through in the seat of Brisbane in this coming federal election in May. And if we do that, I think that'll help realign, and where those realignments go down the track is often hard to predict, but we need a realignment, and that will help make it happen.
Are there specific issues you've identified that you think appeal to Brisbane voters that you're targeting?
A lot of things appeal to people across the board is just general disillusionment and thinking politics is just a farce and a shambles and a joke, which is understandable. And those general issues of cleaning things up, of getting rid of corporate donations, of getting an independent commission against corruption, of getting big donations out of politics in general, resonate very strongly, as they should. And that's one where we've got a lot of strength there, and is a benefit in not being an institutionalised party. We don't have to break free of that because we haven't been ensnared in it. So that is a universal one. But I guess in terms of more localised things, the issues of public transport, but also just getting around and the amenity of your communities, that public transport actually links into cycleways and pedestrian-friendly neighbourhoods. They're all intertwined. And they're all pretty much ignored in favour of more and more roads. Public transport gets a bit here and there, although not much from the federal level usually. Cycling and pedestrian access and stuff is usually completely ignored and seen as, irrelevant council stuff, but a proper injection of funding from federal level alongside removing the corrupting influence of donations, which creates so many bad developments. It's an issue of lack of green space, lack of livability of neighbourhoods, which links to transport and traffic snarls and bad development and planning. They all link in together very strongly. And the issues of, it's not unique to Brisbane by any means, but I do think it's perhaps more pressing in Brisbane than other areas because there's such extremes of wealth, and it is the most unequal electorate in the state when it comes to wealth inequality. There's so many people that struggle on the casualisation of labour, the stagnation of wages, the lack of just protection of your workplace rights, and that links to the lack of protection for your home. So many people renting their home, and the lack of security over being able to stay in your own home, and more of that instability around people's lives just makes life more precarious, and that flows through into costs. And what I'm pushing quite hard is our policy of getting basic dental treatment covered under Medicare. I saw Bill Shorten got some good coverage for getting basic cancer treatment covered under Medicare, which is, looks from what I've seen of it to be a good measure, but it just shows if, the amounts that people are talking about with these income tax cut auctions, tens of billions of dollars a year, if you just put most of that aside, apart from perhaps those for the middle and lower income earners, and invested that into making dental treatment affordable and healthcare affordable. Those are the things that we're nowhere near as bad as America yet, but that's the thing that terrifies people when they're already pretty tight in terms of their finances, and then somebody gets sick or they lose their job, or landlord wants to kick them out, or landlord wants to put the rent up, or landlord wants to sell the house, or they've, kids got to do an extra year of university or TAFE or something. All of those sort of big costs on top. People are already a bit close to the line, a lot of people. So
this is something you've recently had experience with, dealing with cancer last year.
Oh, right, yeah.
Is it expensive to have prostate cancer, Andrew?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm doing a poor me sort of thing, because I'm, way more fortunate than many people. But, the specialist referrals, Medicare doesn't cover half of that. Even your GP backwards and forwards, most people's don't bulk bill. Mine doesn't. I mean, she's great, so... But, the big issue, in my case anyway, was having surgery rather than chemo, but I could have had public hospital, and it's not too long a waiting list, etc., but you don't have so much control over that, and because of both the election campaign and also the small business I'm trying to get started, to have that sort of just dangling and not being able to plan about when your surgery might be. And, thankfully my post-surgery stuff, could not have wished for better. It's been so good, but you don't know that beforehand. There's always potential for complications. So, when your only income is self-employment, and when your other main activities very much time specific to an election date, etc., then wasn't ideal timing, but you can't pick these things. But yeah, I've had private health insurance ever since before my daughter was born, but it's good for some things, but it doesn't cover much when it comes to hospitals. But I was lucky to be able to have people I could borrow money off, etc. So, but the ideal is everyone should be able to access public treatment rapidly and with good quality. But I know the public hospital treatment in that area is quite good.
I understand that prostate cancer is something you have to keep, checking year to year. But is the prognosis good for now?
Yeah. Yeah, I honestly keep forgetting about it. I wasn't sure what you were talking about before. I thought you were talking about my rental housing situation. I thought, how did you know about that? But no, it's going well. I keep forgetting about it.
What was the rental housing situation?
Oh, nothing particular. No, it was just my own thing when I had to move. It was a year and a half ago now, but because the owner sold the house and I had to find another place. And had a fair bit of trouble. Actually got knocked back from a few places, which maybe they'd read the Greens housing policy for renters' rights, which is quite actually possible. Seen stuff I'd said about stopping no-fault evictions or something, but anyway.
I wonder how John O'Sree goes on rental applications.
Yes, maybe that's why he's living on a boat. Wouldn't surprise.
Well, I'm glad you're doing well, Andrew, and all the best in the upcoming election. And thank you very much for talking to me today.
No worries. Thanks for the opportunity.
Andrew will be standing for the seat of Brisbane in the upcoming federal election on May 18. For the record, the other candidates in the seat of Brisbane are Trevor Evans, the incumbent for the Liberal National Party, Paul Newbury for the Labor Party, Anne Perry for Pauline Hanson's One Nation, Aaron Whittaker for the United Australia Party, Rod Genneret for Fraser Anning's Conservative National Party, and Kamala Emanuel for the Socialist Alliance. Corrections and fact-checkings for this episode. Oh, there's a few. These are pretty juicy, actually. What year did Andrew go see Fleetwood Mac when they toured Brisbane? Well, Fleetwood Mac toured Brisbane as part of their Tusk World Tour in 1980. Andrew would have seen them at Festival Hall on either March the 7th or 8th of that year. Fleetwood Mac are next playing Brisbane at the Entertainment Centre on August 20, 2019. Did Paul Keating say, "You want a friend in politics, get a dog"? Well, Michael Douglas's character Gordon Gekko said, "You need a friend, get a dog" in the movie Wall Street in 1987. But the most common attribution is to US President Harry S. Truman. But historians at his own presidential library have never actually found any evidence that he said the words. It is most likely that the misattribution comes from the 1975 play Give 'Em Hell, Harry by Samuel Gallou, in which a fictionalized version of Truman says, "You want a friend in life? Get a dog." The real Harry Truman, by the way, was not much of a dog lover at all. In 1947, a woman from his home state of Missouri sent him a goddamn adorable 5-week-old Cocker Spaniel puppy named Fella. Seriously, look up a picture of this dog online. It is really, really cute. So several months later, a reporter noticed that Fella had not been seen around the White House and asked Truman, "Mr. President, what happened to Fella?" Truman replied, "To what?" "Fella, the puppy," the reporter replied. "Oh, he's around," Truman snapped. And as it turned out, Truman expressed in private that he had neither asked for nor needed a puppy, and he had in fact given Fella away to his personal doctor. One last piece of Truman trivia, because he's kind of interesting. His middle initial S doesn't actually stand for any one name. He was given the initial in honor of both his grandfathers, Anderson Shipp Truman and Solomon Young. This podcast is now The Truman Show. The term Prime Minister as a pejorative, it's not quite how I represented it. So the term Prime Minister was first used to refer to Cardinal Richelieu in France in the 17th century, who was the chief minister under King Louis XIII. So Richelieu was particularly known for centralizing political power under the king, often at the expense of other areas of government, such as the nobility. Now, in the 18th century, when France and Britain were frequent adversaries, a British politician named Robert Walpole was disparagingly referred to as the Prime Minister by his fellow parliamentarians in reference to Richelieu, presumably because of his own tendencies towards centralising power. But since then, in the Westminster system, Prime Minister has become an honorific rather than a pejorative, which is how we get to where we are today. Thank you for listening to this episode. There are 54 just like it. Well, actually none like this, because this is the first politician I've had before. But go listen to them anyway if you haven't. You can follow us on Instagram at Gimme Empathy Podcast. Chuck me a email at Gimothy. My name is Gimothy. Or check us an email at gimmeempathypodcast@gmail.com. I'll see you next time. Until then, stay spiritual.